This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache, don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information. Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR. I am your host, Felix Mitchell, coming to you from a freezing cold day in London. And we have a fantastic guest for you today. He's the author of People, Reach Your Full Potential as a Chief HR Officer. He is the founder of Hex Talent and Development, which is an organizational development consultancy and also specialize in executive coaching. Do a lot of work for HR professionals and people professionals as well, as you can imagine from the book. And then finally, my least favorite thing about Tom is that he is a fellow podcast host. So I feel very under the microscope today. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And you really don't have to worry about my podcasting skills.
Because they're way better.
I'm sure yours are far better than mine.
You guys be the judge of that. Tom, before we get into about the podcast and the book and all of that stuff, could you just give us just a bit of your background in the people space and beyond as well, just so listeners can get a feel for who you are beyond what you're doing right now?
Yeah, so as you said, my name is Tom. I grew up in a little place called Marple on the outskirts of Greater Manchester. Went to university in Manchester and I fell into HR really because I was working at Sainsbury's whilst I was at university and didn't like stacking shelves. Went and knocked on the door of the office. It was the personnel office, as it was called back in those days. And
just
they gave me
just to time date it.
Yeah, just timed it. Yeah, I am in my, I was 46 yesterday, so I am now in my late 40s.
Birthday.
Thank you, yeah. So yeah, I got into personnel as it was then. When I left university, tried my best to get a graduate job, was really good at getting to the last stage and going to these 2-day assessment centres in these country training centres for big companies, just couldn't get the job. So went full-time at Sainsbury's and they really supported me. And then I had a great career, actually, a corporate career in HR, working across retail. I worked in utilities, so car, phone, warehouse. I worked in local government, Manchester City Council. And then I spent most of my career in financial services at HSBC for 8 years, where I did lots of different jobs. And then I was Chief People Officer at a wealth management firm called Brooks Macdonald in the City of London for about 6 years, which was a fantastic experience and where I really, I suppose, honed my craft and took a lot of my experiences from there to take into my business Hex and use my use the insights there to now help other people to be better leaders and better HR professionals.
That's really interesting. I think what really comes across as well is you must have seen the full spectrum, such a big range of industries. Obviously, had your full career. So I think have you found that really useful as you've moved into the world of, I suppose, a big advisory services?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with working for a big organisation, I think, like HSBC, is that you get to meet lots of fabulous specialists. So I was always a generalist. So, I was an HR business partner. I was head of HR for First Direct. And then I was head of HR operations, looking after payroll and all the administration side for 18 months. And you always had lots of great people to take insight from, like, compensation, reward people, talent development people, learning people. But on the flip side, that means that as a generalist, I think I became a little bit de-skilled. So when I then went into the Chief People Officer role, I had a lot to learn really quickly. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later. And going into an SME business, and it was a listed SME business, gave me an opportunity to just see a completely different side of HR and be the number one HR person, which was daunting and lonely. But that's where you learn a lot in those uncomfortable situations where you don't really know what you're doing.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of our listeners come from that SME world, and one of the things that always often strikes me about the challenge, particularly of SME people professionals, is sort of what you mentioned before, this tension between hyper specialism and the sort of deep knowledge that you need in some areas.
Yeah.
And then the need to be generalist at the same time, almost, sort of having to wear multiple hats simultaneously. Is that something that you found different from large organisation to smaller business? Was that something that took some getting used to?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So, I mean, I was lucky at Brooks Macdonald. I had the opportunity to build a really strong team, which is a core part of being a great CHRO, I think, and getting the right skills and the right people. But there were certainly times where I had to really dig into the detail more than I ever did at HSBC. And the biggest example I would give of that, working in financial services in our PLC business, is compensation. An absolute minefield. Understanding the corporate governance required of, paying executive directors, but also the regulation in financial services, really onerous, constantly changing, and having to really get into the detail and understanding. And I think that's probably what was one of my learnings, that if you want to be a great HR person, particularly in financial services, you've got to have a really great grounding in reward. And I think a lot of CHROs perhaps are not necessarily the most numbers focused people, would perhaps go into it for something different. So so there's lots of challenges, but you could extrapolate that across any area of HR, really, that you will have to know more. And if you don't know, you got to go and find it out.
Absolutely. And rewards are a really interesting one, because I think you're right. A lot of people professionals are not numbers folks and self-identify as such. Can you just talk us through why you think reward is so important?
What you pay people, obviously, if you look at like your sort of hierarchy of needs and things like that, it's a core need. I think that if you're not paying people well enough, then you're going to find out about it pretty quickly, whether that shows up in your retention or employee engagement or just your productivity. I think it will show pretty quickly. But I think we also have to think about the opportunity that having really great incentives from a compensation perspective can bring. And I think if you really get into the detail of understanding some of those levers and understanding how they link with your talent management approach, your recruitment approach, and thinking about where you actually want to be as a business in terms of the market, in terms of what you pay, I think you can use it as a really valuable lever to engage and attract and retain the very best talent.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think one of the things that I find fascinating about reward and about compensation and benefits generally is how counterintuitive it can be, and also how sometimes there are sort of vested or legacy ways of doing things in an industry that are very hard to buck the trend from. And there's a book that we absolutely love in my business, Instant Impact, which is called No Rules Rules, which is, if you haven't read it, a fantastic read. It's written by the founder of Netflix on the way. And, I know they've got some, how good's their culture? I don't know, but certainly really successful business in its time and now. But they have a really fascinating approach to talent and compensation and benefits. I think the first thing is that they purposefully pay a slightly above market rate to be able to get the very best people in. And the other is that they don't believe in bonuses at all. So everything's on salary, which I know in a lot of businesses can cause, to get something like that across as a chief people officer can be incredibly challenging. Yeah. I wonder if you have an approach to comp and bens that you recommend, or that you think is the right way to think about it.
Well, I think what you've got to make sure you do is, and this is the same for any aspect of being a great chief people officer, having a great people function, is never to think about anything in isolation. So paying people lots of money is probably no compensation for having a really great culture with really great leadership and all that. All the good stuff that we know engages people. So I think you just got to just don't treat it in isolation. In terms of, is there a right model between like what percentage you put in your base, what percentage you put in your variable, what percentage you put in your long-term incentives? I think that's industry specific. I think that's quite dependent on the individual and what you're trying to get, out of them. But yeah, don't ever think about compensation in isolation, and don't just throw money at people, because that will work for some, but it will only work for a few.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I guess the flip side of that as well is having a great culture is no compensation for paying people peanuts. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's a really nice segue into your book, maybe into some of the work that you do at Hex. But let's talk about people first. It's all around this concept of making sure that chief HR officers, chief people officers how to help them make the most out of their role, out of them. Why did you write the book in the first place? What's the pain point you're looking to solve?
Well, so when I became chief people officer at Brooks Macdonald, like I've said, it was a big challenge. Like I went into it, my eyes probably weren't really that open when I went into it. I had a fantastic boss and was really well supported and empowered. But I found it really lonely. And, as a chief people officer, everybody's coming to you for things, coming to you for advice and support. But where does the chief people officer go? There really isn't anywhere often for people to go and get the help that they need. So I had to learn a lot of technical stuff really quickly. When I look back on my time, I have lots of reflections about what I did well and what I could have done better. And I felt that there was something missing that could, really be a great support to chief people officers as they either go into the role or as they reflect on how they're performing in the role and what they want to change and what they want to do better. So that was where the idea for the book came from, because I was coaching lots of HR people and I was seeing lots of similar problems that came up. So the book is a work of fiction, which is slightly different for a business book. So it tells the story of Joanna, who is a chief HR officer in a financial services company, and she's struggling. And so she goes to a coach to get some support, and they together work through something called the CHRO Impact Framework, which is the framework I've developed. And through the story, she tries new things, she tries new behaviours, and you see how she progresses and how she improves. And the idea is that you follow along the story of Joanna, and you use the opportunity to reflect on your own performance and what's going on for you, and try some new things. And it's all about being brave, being courageous, and trying to make some behavioural change.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it's really interesting to do it in the form of almost like a novel, right?
There's lots of neuroscience behind stories, and the parts of the brain that stories light up, that it can be more compelling if you've got a bit of a story to tell.
Hey, I believe it. I spent a lot of my time, I can only speak about reading books about building businesses, because I've never been a chief HR officer. But I spent a lot of time reading those sorts of books and getting a lot of advice. And I feel like often the lesson only sinks in when I've made the mistake that I was being counselled not to make it. I read a book about this, and that was the wrong way to approach it.
Yeah.
I think for me, it sped up the learning process, but it didn't eradicate the mistake in the first instance. But I could definitely see how it'd be really powerful to see someone else make a mistake and learn through, hopefully, their failures. So, when it happens to you, you don't make the same one.
Yeah, and I suppose Joanna as a character, it was a really interesting process writing, but this is the first book that I've written, and I think I've got a couple more in me at somewhere, but it was really interesting to develop a character. So after I'd been writing it for a while, I would write something and I would read it back and I would think, actually, she wouldn't say that, or
really
she wouldn't do it, and it was just really interesting to sort of explore that. And obviously there's a bit of me and Joanna, and there's a bit of some of the other chief HR officers that I work with. I find generally that chief HR officers are really passionate and driven people, but like I say, are often just suffering a bit from that level of loneliness and not sure where to go to get support.
So let's talk about where they can go to get support. If someone's listening to this and they're lonely, struggling chief HR officer, what sort of steps they can take to surround themselves with a little bit more support, some more resources?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, obviously you could go to a coach, like, there's loads of coaches around. You could go to a coach like me that's got some specialism in supporting HR people. There's a bit of mentoring in there as well. Or you can, you can read a book, like you can read People. I think the other thing though that you can do is to be a bit braver about asking for help, because I think we're not generally very good at asking for help. We're not generally very good at asking for what we need. And lots of the HR people that I know, and I was like this as well, because they're in charge of the learning budget, they feel slightly guilty about spending it on themselves or their own team, tend to prioritise other people. And it's a really important role within the business. You're dealing with, your people strategy. Your people are generally the most expensive asset that you've got in any company. And so, you deserve it. So be assertive and go and look for it. The model that I've developed as part of People is based on, hopefully it's a relatively simple model, but it's quite comprehensive. So anybody that wants to have some more detail on the models, really welcome to contact me, and I'll send something out to them for free.
We can actually include it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. So it's based on two axes. So what's going on inside the HR team, and then what's going on outside the HR team and in the wider market, and then what you do and how you do it. It's got a core mindset at the centre, which is about being purposeful and always learning. So, making sure that your purpose is really clear, you understand what you're there for as an HR person. Often, I think I found that I had to continuously recontract with people what I was there for. You'd have all sorts of strange questions come to you as the HR guy, and you can like, well, why on earth are you asking me that? It's nothing to do with me. So, having that recontracting process, because people's idea of what HR is can often be quite different to yours. Then there are 4 skills. So the first one is being a commercial explorer, and what I mean by that is really understanding the business and understanding how you make money or how you provide services to your clients and what's going on in the broader marketplace. Because, I think I naively went into HR because I liked people, and I do like people. I'm highly extroverted, enjoy spending time with people. What I didn't realise was that when you are an HR person, often you're speaking to people when they're really not at their best. They're not in the best situations. And so, that can be quite challenging. But you need to get into the business and really understand it. The second one is about being an expert in the field. We've talked a bit about that already. You've got to know your onions as HR. You don't have to know everything in detail, because you've got a team for that. But you've got to have really good basic expertise in HR. Then you've got to be a leader HR. You've got to be a good broader leader as well. Come on to that in a minute. And then I've called the final skill a culture and performance catalyst, and that's recognising what you can do to be the guardian of culture to drive it so that it performs really highly. And then overlapping each of the skills, or overlapping to each sort of pair of skills, are the personas, and they are business talent enabler and HR talent enabler. So that's about being the gatekeeper of talent in your organisation. You can't develop the talent yourself, but you can make sure that the right talent is coming in, and you can make sure you've got the right frameworks and you're influencing leaders to develop the right talent. Being an enterprise leader, so that's working outside the people agenda. So a great chief people officer should be asking the right questions about the business and not just about the people. And then finally, being a trusted partner. And I think particularly in a listed business, you've got a lot of different priorities. People's, your stakeholders' priorities can be quite different, and sometimes they conflict. So your priorities might be a bit different to the ExCo, the CEO, the CFO, and the REMCO chair, for example, some of those key contacts. So how you build those trusted partnerships is a really important aspect of the role.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's got quite a comprehensive.
Yeah, it's quite a long answer. I apologise.
No, it's what I was looking for. It's the reason we wanted you on the show today. And I often feel in the people function generally, but particularly for leadership, there is this feeling sometimes of just being a little cut adrift, a little directionless. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all. It's just there are so many so many challenges, so many stresses put on people leadership, and it's just getting more and more complex. And I think through doing this show and through the work that we do partnering with HR leaders, one thing's just become really crystal clear to me, which is there is a people side to everything. And it really came across in the point that you made that you make around, you know, being a business partner and being a commercial explorer. If you don't have that curiosity, and if you don't have that element of teamwork, and to pull it back to what you were talking about before around asking for help, you'll never understand enough about all of the different elements of the business to be able to do the people bit, right? And I think you can't give a short answer to the question I asked, because it is complex, and that's kind of why we're here today.
I mean, I was always worried when I was when I was a chief people officer. I was worried about that. I was wasting people's time by asking stupid questions, and I think it's very rare that you can ask a stupid question. Actually, I think, you know, I wish I'd asked more questions. Probably now. I think I would have been more effective if I'd, you know, got to learn more about what was going on in the business by asking some questions and taking up some people's time, because generally people are happy to share their time if you're asking their expertise.
People are happy to do two things way more than we think they're going to be able to ask questions in a professional environment. And I can't think of anyone coming up to me and asking me a question that annoyed me. I'm just like, oh yeah, cool, you're interested in what I'm doing. Fantastic, let me tell you about it. So people are always happy to answer your questions, and especially when you're in an enablement function, I think they just trust you more once you're finding out more about their department. And the other thing is, people are way more willing to help you than I think particularly Brits think they're going to be. And I think there's almost a cultural aversion to saying, you know, I just don't understand this. Can you help?
But there's a level. I mean, there's a level of shame in it as well if you don't know the answer to things, and you know. But you can't know the answer to everything. You can only find out the answer to things if you ask the question. So I encourage people to make it part of their identity that they ask questions and that they're interested, and they push through the discomfort of doing that. That's
really interesting. Tom, I wonder to zoom out a little bit and maybe take a bit of a reflection on the journey so far. Do you find that through your having left the world of being a people practitioner and moving into the world of supporting people practitioners, if you knew when you were a chief people officer at Brooks Macdonald what you know now, being an expert coach of other people practitioners, being an author, being a podcast host, working as a supplier to other HR professionals, do you think you'd have changed the way that you operated?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer. Like, what I recognise now and what I help people with is recognising in the moment when they're in the emotion of a situation. So, you know, when I think about, you know, perhaps dealing with some tricky comp issues with executive director pay, for example. And I remember being right in the centre of, you know, executive directors who, you know, I've got a key relationship, you know, I work for, having one set of priorities. I've got my idea about what I think is the right thing to do. I've got regulations to think about, and then I've got a Remco chair who has got different priorities. And I think about how stressful I found those situations at times and how difficult I found them to deal with. I think now, looking back, obviously you can recognise that being in that emotion and not recognising at the time that I was in that emotional state meant that I was making decisions which perhaps weren't always the best decisions and the best judgments. And what I recognise now that I've been able to step back from the role is that, you know, your last decision is never going to be your last decision. Like, you know, you'll make a decision, there'll be a consequence for that, and then you'll make the next decision, and there's a consequence for that. And you know, I would absolutely trust myself much more to, you know, to make the right decision and try and be able to take the emotion out of the situations and the drama out of the situations. I also recognise that is very, very difficult to do. So it's not like now I don't get caught up in the emotion of, client relationships that I might have that might get a little bit difficult and I get quite stressed out about it, or, problems where I don't know what the solution is. But I definitely think a big part of being an effective coach is helping people to come out, zoom out, and see the situation for what's going on pragmatically, and not emotionally.
I love that. I think it's so important. I'm a really, by the way, I'm going to try and take your advice on that. I'm like the world's most hyper emotional person. It's very annoying.
It's a strength, right? But it is a strength. But most things are strengths, right? And they can at times stop helping you.
Yeah.
And it's recognizing when that's happening.
I'm definitely in the world where I recognize it's not helpful, but can't do anything about it. But I try and take. So I always forget which mega pop star it was who said this. It was either, and these are quite different, Lady Gaga or Cher.
Right. They are quite different.
Or it could be someone different again.
Yeah.
But one of them said, if you're stressed or upset about something, think about whether you'll still be upset about it in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
And if the answer is you'll probably not remember it, then just forget about it.
Well, I would go one step further than that, and I would say, are you still going to be stressed out about this in 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, or 5 years?
Yeah.
And, if it's any more than 5 hours, then you probably shouldn't be worrying about it, because you probably won't be. It's emotions are our superpower as human beings. We're one of the only creatures on Earth that can override our instincts and our emotions. So that's great. But we are essentially, animals, and we've got thousands and thousands of years of evolution behind us. And the world has changed irrecognisably in the last couple of thousand years, but even in the last 10,000 years. But our brains, unfortunately, are still 70,000 years behind. So we will get emotional when we receive that email that gets on our nerves, or when we're in a conversation with someone and they disagree with us. And we have all the same instincts as we would have done 70,000 years ago when we thought something was going to kill us. But we've got to be able to override them, and that's a big part about coaching and developing yourself to recognise when you're in that state and be able to move on.
Yeah, and I guess it's also, I joked and said that I didn't think my emotions were important, but they are. They are useful.
Exactly.
And recognising when they're being helpful and when they're not.
Yeah.
So we've spoken about the book. I think I don't want to overplug Beyond Potential, your podcast, but you run it, and some. I know you had some great guests on that. What have you learned through that experience of having, really inspirational guests on to talk about whatever you want to talk about that day? How have you found it? Because I know I've loved it. It's basically my hobby.
Yeah, I think so. I present Beyond Potential with another guy called Tom, and we toyed with all sorts of ideas of the name, like we were going to call it like 2 Toms and 1 Mike, but then we sort of decided, well, maybe like 1 Tom might decide that he didn't want to do it anymore, and then we'd be left with having to find another co-host called Tom, so we called it Beyond Potential.
Also feels like you might be cutting yourself off at the feet there if you wanted to buy 2 mics.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So we interview all sorts of guests. It's really broad, and we learned some great things from that. I mean, like the last person we interviewed, which is an episode that will come out in a few weeks, a guy called Andre Coggins, who is a running coach. So very different, but he runs a running. He calls it a running community, not a running club, up in North London called Mafia Moves. Like really diverse, really sort of helping lots, like very, very diverse communities, some quite disadvantaged, get into running and all the benefits that that fitness can bring. So so we had him on, and we had Deborah Corey on, who I know you've had on this podcast, talking about her book, which is a completely different sort of subject. And I think in everything, you every person we interview, you get a bit of inspiration that's a little bit different, and a little tidbit of information that you can take along in your career and the way you operate it. So I agree with you. It's a hobby, and yeah, it's probably the best hour or two that we spend a week.
Likewise. And I think that kind of rounds us off for today's episode. Tom, thank you so much for joining me and us today. It's been a really fascinating conversation. And if people want to see your book, buy your book, best place to do that, what would you say?
So it's available for pre-order on all the major booksellers like Waterstones and Amazon, WH and things like that. So you can pre-order it through that. Anybody who gets in contact with me, it's not out till March, but anybody who gets in contact with me, I'm very happy to send them a free copy, by the way. And I've also put together a workbook or a guide to the CHRO Impact Framework, which I'm really happy to send, as I said, to anybody who wants one. Just go to my website. I'm sure you'll put in the show notes, and they can just ask me for a copy there, and I'll send them a copy through in the post. And that gives an opportunity to work through the framework, asks some reflection questions, so you can really think about what am I doing well and what might I want to try that's a bit different.
Yet another reason to be We Need to Talk About HR listener. There we go. Keep the benefits coming. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day whenever you're tuning in.